We are in a transition towards a circular economy. The economic, environmental, and societal benefits are increasingly evident, and more companies are shifting towards circular strategies. And this brings rise to the question, how do we measure this? Welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the online festival of ideas that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? And today we will be talking about measuring circularity. How do we actually measure the progress towards a circular economy? And why do we want to do this? Today in the studio I have two guests, and my first guest is Roy Verkoelen. He is a clean tech startup entrepreneur with a passion for circular economy and cradle to cradle, CEO and co-founder of Circular IQ and the creator of a decision-making software for circular economy. Hi Roy, welcome to the DIF studio.
Thanks for having me.
And also with me today in the studio I have Sven Herman from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. He joined us in 2014 already, and he has been working on circularity indicators. Welcome, Sven.
Great to be here. Thanks, Emma.
So, just to kick off with the first question, Roy, you made a decision-making software for the circular economy. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, Emma, I can. I'll try. So basically in this transition towards circularity, companies and businesses and governments want to be able to compare circularity aspects of products they use and buy. And right now there are not a lot of tools available that really allow for simple comparison, because most of the companies are using different metrics to basically communicate about their sustainability. By using our software, you can generate clear and simple reports that allow you to simply see which supplier and product best meets your own circularity goals.
And Sven, you've been working on the Circularity Indicators report. So can you tell me how this is distinct with their approach with the software?
Yeah, sure. So we're working on this first project to understand how to measure circularity, which was now, I think, 4 years ago. It was on the early days when I was at the foundation. And what we came up with there is we developed one distinct new kind of measurement that measures the circulation of materials specifically in the circular economy. So we're looking at what kind of measurements are already existing and so on. And what we came up with is saying, well, for a lot of aspects of the circular economy, like toxicity, like energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, material risk, all those kind of things, we actually have already a lot of measurements and tool, and we didn't see to reinvent the wheel. So what we said is, well, we're going to develop this one new specific measurements that focuses on material flows, and then if you're making decisions, then you would use this indicator together with a list of other indicators, and I think that fits quite well with the approach that Roy has been talking about in terms of looking at different aspects for decision making. But what we developed was one specific measurement for circularity, while you are probably taking quite a more broader approach.
Yeah.
So what kind of other indicators do you use beyond material flows in your software?
Yeah, so we've learned that procurement officials of companies are really more and more interested in understanding what is in the products they buy. So they want to know more about the ingredients, the materials that are in there. Is it easy to get these materials out of the product after you use it? Do we have evidence about the safety of these materials used? Do we have certificates in place? Is there recycled content, or is the content from a renewable source? These are all very straightforward types of information that really support decision making about circularity of products in an easy way, where decision makers can really see the differences of between products that look relatively similar by looking more and more into the detailed information about their composition.
And so who are asking these types of questions about their products? Are those designers or are those managers or maybe senior managers? Who wants to know this type of information?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Emma. Obviously, we think that everyone should ask that question, but we're not there yet. So what we're seeing right now is that government officials are becoming more and more progressive. They're in charge of huge budgets, they have huge spends, and they get more and more, let's say, circularity goals in place already. So these procurement officials, we're trying to, let's say, give them the feeling that every time they purchase something, they have the power to change things. By integrating circularity indicators into their decision-making criteria and by asking questions about what's in the product, where does it come from, is it safe, how can I reuse it, they're influencing the entire supply chain and the system behind the product itself. And this generates huge positive impact and can be a lever towards accelerating the transition towards the circular economy. And that's really our goal.
And do you think that they will also start asking the right questions or different types of questions to, for example, their suppliers? Because they are now focusing on what elements actually contribute to circularity?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think what Sven was also saying earlier, I don't think it's about one indicator or just focusing on the product. I think we need to talk about the circular economy on multiple levels, but we do see that consumers, also in the business to business, they purchase a product, they want to identify with that product. So the product is basically our first focus point, and then we help them to ask relevant questions about that product related to the circular economy. Not from the perception that this is the complete questionnaire, but that this is a start of questions that make sense to ask, that businesses can answer, and should be able to answer, to include them in the decision making to really achieve impact.
And can we maybe, a question to both of you, can we dig into what kind of questions really determine if something is circular? What kind of questions do you wish, these people will start asking their suppliers and other teams in their organization?
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's probably no simple answer to that question on what constitutes circular. There's always you want to of course have as much circulation as possible. You want to get as much value out of the material you're using as possible. Depending on the product, there can be completely different strategies. Sometimes it might be ideal to offer the product in a different business model. Sometimes there's just an easy way to make your product more easy to be disassembled so that it can be more easily recycled, or maybe you can reuse parts of it and so on. So it completely depends on which product you're looking at, what are the most important aspect for you. And that's why I think we kind of both say it's kind of quite important to give the decision makers the right different types of measurements to look at, A, and B, kind of the right of kind of knowledge and high-level idea where they want to go, what are the goals of a circular economy.
Do you agree with that? Would you add some of these questions?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think we were seeing, especially in the past years, a lot of let's say discussions about, I don't know exactly what the circular economy is. There are 200x definitions, so we first have to figure out the definition before we can take action. Well, I think that's bullshit, basically. I think we should start acting right now, and I think we can come up with a lot of, let's say, straightforward goals that relate to the circular economy, that are not all encompassing, but are things that we can start asking questions about right now, that we know that will help us progress in that transition. And one of these goals is, for instance, eradicating waste or decreasing waste. And a good indicator on a product level to ask to your suppliers is, okay, after I'm done with this product, what percentage of the weight is reusable, repairable, recyclable, biodegradable, compostable? If it's neither of these, then it will most likely become waste. So I'm buying waste, and I'm really not helping to retain the value of materials, which I think is a very important, let's say, driver for the circular economy.
So it's actually like it goes beyond just measuring progress. It's actually also mapping out what you need to look out for when you want to transition towards a circular business model. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think the main barriers are also in communicating. I mean, I think one of the things that we learned in our business is that's really about interacting with people and being able to explain to your suppliers, to your teams, what it is you want, why you're asking a question, why it's relevant to you, where you want to go with that information, why you need it, why you value it. If you can communicate that in a straightforward, simple way, then your supplier will be likely to engage with you, and you can team up. And that's why we've created also this software, because we think digitization is a very powerful tool to facilitate collaboration alongside value chains while also being able to preserve intellectual property and, let's say, the identities of the stakeholders involved.
So if I think about measuring something, I think about numbers or scores that we give to things like, but we're now talking about this like almost as a tool for transformation. Are we still giving, objects, products, services, a score? Or how does it work when we want to measure something like that?
So I think it's a little bit of both, I guess, in a way. So what we won't do is just like look at a product and do some analysis and say, okay, this is the score for this product, and that solves all so it's like the complete circularity score. But looking at all these different aspects that we discussed earlier, like how much waste can be produced, like how much waste would you might want to have as your product, or all kinds of other aspects, you still want to like have measurable like components, and some will be like very quantitative scores, and other aspects that you might look at might be more qualitative. But you still want to have some kind of measurements, in particular if you want to make comparisons between like slightly different product designs, for example, having like quantitative measurements, even though they might not be ideal and solve everything, can be like a huge help.
And if we look at your circularity indicators, can you, because I think you are measuring those in percentages, right?
It's not really percentage, but it gives you like a score between 0 and 1 that tells you how well the materials are circulated, basically related to the product.
Can you have like a perfect score? Can you have a perfect circular product?
Well, in theory, I guess you could, right? In the sense that if everything, you don't have any like loses, the product never breaks, no one throws it into like the bin by accident or whatever, then yes. But in practice, you'll likely never have a 100% 100% like fully circular product. But you can always you should always aim for that in order to achieve like the best outcomes.
And with your circular software, can you get a perfect circular product?
Well, no. Because what we see in the market, circularity, if you discuss it with procurement officials, with governments, with businesses, it becomes more or less personal, and we think it's a good thing. Each company has their own identity, they have their own vision, they have their own strategy, and I think an ideal goal set fits with the identity of a company. And this, for us, means that there should be diversity in the strategies you deploy to achieve a similar set of goals that ultimately contribute to retaining the value of products and materials and preserving them for future generations. So it's kind of this balance. And coming back to your previous question also about scoring. I think Transparency is also a very important factor, and having more specific information about the characteristics of the materials and the products we use than we have now. It's not necessarily about a percentage or about a score. It's more or less about knowing where something comes from, how you can get it out of the product after when you want to repair it or when you want to reuse it, and then what your potential is for future use. What's next for this component? How can you reuse it while adding, let's say, a minimum of amount of energy, for example?
So I have one question that just came in, and that is, Angela asks you, Roy, what is your favorite example of a near circular product? And in what way is it lacking in this case?
Oh, well, that is that's a tough question. I will say that one of the inspiring products that we work with is one of our customers is Ecor. And they have a fiber-based material that can basically be reused over and over again, while it's also biodegradable. So this is, I think, an example material that has multiple, let's say, options for what's next, and provides a lot of flexibility towards users for how to reuse the product and the components again and again. And it also provides opportunity to put in something personal in the product, because they work with fibers that can be specifically related to the company they work with. So I would say that this is an interesting, very interesting product with huge potential. Yeah.
And where do you think would be the biggest challenge for them to really, take the next step in, becoming more circular?
Yeah. So the discussions we had with them, and which they actually brought up, are about generations, because since you can use these fibers over and over again, at some point you want to be able to communicate or register how many times this fiber itself has been used for a specific product or material. So you can maybe prioritize fibers that have, let's say, generation 10 over fibers from generation 1. So this is some, let's say, aspect that becomes, let's say, adds a level of complexity, but is interesting, thinking about generations of materials that have been used in their same form in many products.
Definitely. And before we move on to really zooming out from products to maybe a bigger system, we're going to listen to my coworker. And we will be listening now to Karen, and she will explain what is next at the DIF, because we have many sessions coming up in the next 3 weeks, and they are all super interesting, so you definitely have to check out the schedule. But these are her favorite 3 picks for the coming day or week. Here she comes.
Hola, my name is Karen, and I would like to recommend you 3 DIF sessions. Immediately after this one at 2 p.m. UK time, the speakers will be solving one of the world's greatest challenges, plastics in the sea. So stay tuned to discover how they will do it. Also tonight at 8 p.m., Lucy Poulet, who has worked with the European Space Agency, will tell us in this session about Melissa, their closed-loop life support system designed for space travel. And finally, listen to this podcast on catch-up. Emma Fromberg investigates how materials could be safe, healthy, and circular, and how might we make smarter material choices. So there you go, 3 sessions you don't want to miss during the DIF.
And we're back again. So we just spoke about products and measuring circularity. I just want to zoom out now and look at the bigger system, because the circular economy talks about the economy and not just only about products. So, Roy, Sven, if we look at the bigger system, such as a city, how should they measure circularity? Who would like to start off with that question?
I can start off, because I've had many conversations with many different stakeholders, from companies, of course, but we're also working a lot with governments, working with other organizations like the UN, for example, and so on. So there are various different levels where there's an interest in measuring circularity. And while we focus on the product level earlier, where you're going into like very specific things, once you're getting broader, you of course don't really have like a possibility to understand all the details. You had to get more high-level measurements. And I think one thing that's important there is that even though your indicators on a, say, city level will likely be completely bit different than at a product level, you still want to work towards like the same goals and want to have some kind of like common goals that you work towards within the framework of like your specific indicators. And if you're looking at the city level specifically, there's a lot of interest going there and trying to understand various things that can be measured related to circular economy. So the City of London, for example, they want to become more circular. They have a circular economy roadmap and strategy, right? And they did like an investigation on what would be the things we want to measure, and they came up with very different things. They came up with measuring things like, well, decreasing the material intensity, for example, which is quite related to actually measuring the material circularity. But they also came up with other things like measuring like the impact of specific projects, or measuring like what impact does circular economy have on jobs and so on. So there are various kind of things that you might want to measure, and it will be different for different kinds of like organization depending on your strategy, but ultimately you kind of want to have the same goals.
Okay, so what I'm picking from this is that it's difficult to say these are the ingredients to be fully circular. But if you look at the goals, such as maybe employment or water or materials flows maybe, we could maybe get to grips with potentially comparing different cities. Am I right?
Yeah, well, so for instance, we're now drafting a proposal for the Amsterdam metropolitan area together with C2C Expo Lab and TNO in the Netherlands. And they also want to become an international leader in the circular economy. And we're suggesting also goals and strategy approach for them, but also try to be focused on really selecting lighthouse projects, because we think it's very good to have, let's say, a big audacious goal as a city that inspires people, but at the same time you also need to have very clear, straightforward projects that you basically use to communicate to your citizens, to your people, to your stakeholders, and that really show that you're walking the talk. And I think that's where we arrive back again at the identity or the personality aspect. And I mean, London and the Amsterdam metropolitan area are totally different. So it's not weird that they have different routes for becoming more circular and have established different lighthouse projects. So I think comparison is a very relevant topic, but there should also be room for diversity and identity, if you ask me.
So what are these goals? Are these the principles of a circular economy, or do they go a bit more into depth on certain topics?
So I mean, it depends what you're talking about. Specifically for cities, we already mentioned a little bit what the goals could be. And if you want to have like kind of overarching-ish goals that fit into like all kinds of different levels where you might want to measure circularity, you want to go to those things like, we have on screen here, stop wasting, like no waste. In the sense you want to minimize the amount of waste you create per inhabitant of your city or per dollar of profit you create. And you want to, a second goal could a second more high-level goal could be you want to minimize the amount of virgin non-renewable resources that you're using. And another goal could be, minimize the amount of pollution that is created in your city, in the economy, or if you're a company, the amount of pollution that you create. So, and you would also want to look into if we're talking about like biological materials and food and those kind of things, which we didn't so far. But then you also want to have regenerate natural systems. You don't want to, you don't want to just like take stuff to create your food and then like deplete the soil and so on. So those kind of 4 things might be like goals that everyone can agree on in some sense as like high-level goals, and then you would like based on this develop your specific goals, A, and B, your specific strategy on how to achieve these goals.
Yeah.
And ideally, all cities would have similar types of formulation of how they explain their goals, so we can compare them, or
Yeah, well, that's of course a tricky one. But I think being able to compare and having transparency fits very well with the circular economy concept. And I think our problem, as Sven hinted to earlier, isn't really in trying to figure out the metrics. I think we have a lot of these metrics sorted in one way or the other. It's about initiating a conversation relating to, okay, if we measure, like for instance, the amount of virgin inputs in a product, then what is our calculation? What is the scope? Because one of the problems that we see right now is that there's flexibility and variety in scope. People are saying that there's no virgin content in the product because they didn't put any virgin content in the product, or they don't involve the entire supply chain. So there are a lot of challenges once you dive in. So I think one of the things that are on our agenda, and we would like to collaborate with others on, is trying to figure out how you can calculate these aspects, these metrics in a meaningful way, without making things too complex, but still allowing for feasibility in the business when arriving at meaningful results. But that's a tricky balance.
Yes, I agree with that. I think it's always important to get the right balance between something that is fit for you and something that is comparable between different like organization and different types of organizations even. When I was just like from like the conversations we had here about measurements with all kinds of different stakeholders, we kind of consistently get 2 points. One is, well, we want to have something that is like standardized and comparable, but secondly, they also have very specific requirements that are relevant for them. And if you talk to different people, those are often quite different. So again, it's about having the right balance between, well, defining things very concretely that you can compare them, but still allowing flexibility, maybe in terms of how you use them or in terms of what your strategy is actually to achieve them, to allow for like individuals or individual organizations.
So if we look at at measuring circularity and to different types of products such as buildings versus consumables, does the product lifespan matters when you measure both? Because you can make quick iterations on, for example, your consumables, your packaging, your plastic bags. But if you try to transform a building or to build a new building, by the time that you even get your materials back, you're maybe 50 years down the line. Does that have a lot of impact in if people even want to measure their circularity?
Yeah, well, what we see happening right now, I think we're still at the forefront. So our customers are mainly the front runners. It's not as if we've hit mainstream yet. And we see that these front runners right now, they understand the potential of retaining the value of materials. But it's not something that has a direct or a short-term payout. So right now we're also focusing on products like, for instance, office furniture that make use of materials that have very long use times, that are not used up, that are still there when you're finished with the product, like iron, for example, and they have residual value in them. So this makes it easier to come up with a business case if the materials are still there at the end of the product life. And that helps a lot in the business world today, because in the end, it also needs to fit within their, let's say, bottom line.
Yes, I mean, I agree, and like maybe coming back to your question, of course, it doesn't make a lot of sense to compare, say, like a loaf of bread with a building in terms of what is the circularity. That's not really kind of what you want to do. But at the end, what you want to do is, well, how can I make like the production or whatever, everything related to this loaf of bread in a way that it fits with the high-level goals, and how can I make this building with the high-level goals? And you probably want to define like certain specific indicators that are very relevant for buildings and others that are very relevant for bread. And well, there probably won't be any overlap, but then you might have other products that are kind of more close together, say like plastic packaging and paper packaging. And there you want to have that some of the indicators are kind of comparable at the end at some point. So it is about having something that is very specific for what you need for, but then at the end, if you're using specific definitions, trying to define what does virgin input mean or what does recyclable mean, that you want to have like the same definition even for different products, so that at the end, if someone wants to compare it, they actually can.
And, oh, yeah?
Yeah, and I think in the end, it's not just about, it's also about connection points and design for disassembly. I mean, you can have a material that's perfectly set out to be reusable, but if it's glued or fixed to a product in a way where you cannot disassemble it, then it's still impossible or not feasible to retain the value of that material. So I think in terms of scope, it's also very a smart thing to do is to look at the way components and materials are connected inside the product. If these connection points are accessible and reversible, because that's very valuable information if you want to extend the lifetime of products or want to make them more flexible.
But I'm sure that you would include that in your circular economy decision software,
yeah,
right?
But definitely, we include it, but it's not, and we think it's very important. But this is information that's not that's not common. I mean, it's totally logical, and no one is discussing the logic, but it's just we don't register this or reward it when we make a decision to purchase one product over the other. I mean, for instance, if you look at the there's no design for disassembly in the chair that you're sitting on right now. But if you would compare that to a desk chair from, for instance, Arendt, they're designed for disassembly. So these materials are preserved for future generations.
Just to move on to some of the questions from the audience, because we got heaps of questions in from viewers that are watching, and they either comment their question in the comment box next to the session or they tweet using #ThinkDiff. And one of the questions is from Vince, and he asks us, is there a risk of making circular economy a reductionist idea by being rigidly comparing inputs and outputs? The circular economy is surely a way of thinking, an aspiration for how an economy can work at a high level. Who wants to give this a go? Sven.
I can try. It's a very long question, so I try to pass it. So, well, there's always a risk, but I don't think that there's actually a high risk, because the circular economy, how it's usually perceived and framed, is about creating value. It's about getting more value out of the material that you have, rather than just like cutting on how much value you get. So you don't want to reduce the amount of, like, I don't know, time you don't want to reduce how much you travel, for example, but you want to reduce the amount of cars that exist. You want to find better ways and more effective ways to use the finite amount of material that we have. And of course, you could always say, well, the most circular thing would be we're not using anything. But in practice, that wouldn't make a lot of sense. And I don't think a lot of people are thinking about it that way. So I don't really see that there's a high risk of those things happening. But of course, you always have to be careful what kind of indicators you use and to make sure that you don't set like kind of wrong incentives in some way. But in like the circular economy space, from like the vast like experience that I had, I didn't really see anything that like went to in this reductionist direction.
Do you also want to give that a go? This way of measuring?
I think if you're heading down towards the reduction, let's say, avenue, from my understanding, you're looking more, you're asking yourself efficiency related questions. And I think it's more about the effectiveness type of questions. Does it really make sense to design and produce a product in the way we're producing it? If we look at circular economy principles, for instance, I think these are the types of questions. That's how you should approach the framework. And then I think the risks for arriving at wrong incentives are at least decreased. Yeah.
To finish off, because we are almost running out of time, I asked you both to think about a piece of advice that you would like to say to the diff viewers that are watching. And these could be, people in governments or in businesses, startups, maybe within the supply chain. What would you like to say to our diff viewers that want to start measuring circularity within their job or within their company? Do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, I want to give it a go. I would just say, every time you buy something, you really have the power to change the system. So really use your purchasing power to demand circularity from producers and manufacturers you use and buy products from. I think that's a very good start and powerful lever to really accelerate the transition towards the circular economy.
Use your purchasing power.
Exactly.
Sven.
Yeah, that's a very good advice. So what I would say in addition is kind of make sure that whatever you do is kind of aligned with the overall aim of achieving a circular economy. So you develop your own strategy, but try to work towards like the overarching goals that should be achieved at the end.
Working towards the bigger goals, right? Thank you guys so much. This was great. So thank you, Roy. Thank you, Sven. And this was all that we had time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to this diff session. There are many more sessions coming up. Have a look at the schedule at thinkdiff.co. And don't forget to ask all your questions in the discussion box on the right-hand side or on Twitter using #thinkdiff. See you later today. Bye.